It's a particularly exciting time in education. Higher education tends to be getting the headlines right now in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and so forth, but in K-12 education as well. Online and blended learning are growing rapidly across the country, and my sense is that despite policy in some places, what we're going to see is in Disrupting Class, we made this prediction that by 2019, 50% of all high school courses would be delivered online in some form or fashion. My sense is that that prediction is going to be roughly true almost regardless of what policymakers do. The question, I think, is, will it be any good? And will it actually create a student-centric education system? And to me, that's the big question. And a critical piece of that is thinking about creating the right conditions for innovation. And then, as Kelly said, to really help educators focus on the implementation on the ground. But it's a big shift for the way we've historically regulated and thought about education, public education in this country. And so I thought I'd start with this overriding question about what is competency-based learning, and why, in my opinion, is it one of a handful of policies that is absolutely critical to getting right so that we have the right conditions on the ground for this innovation to truly create this student-centric education system that can allow each child to realize his or her fullest human potential. And I actually thought I would sort of talk about this as I'm wont to do from the innovation perspective by telling a story from far outside of education. And I thought I would tell it from the perspective of building cars. Now, some people in the audience you might say it's kind of inappropriate to talk about building cars and educating students, but bear with me a little bit. The story I want to tell is one of our friends, Steve Spear, who's a professor at MIT. It's not as good as Georgia Tech, and you'll see why shortly. Was studying the car manufacturing process in both one of the Detroit automakers and then with Toyota. And some years ago, he actually went to one of the Detroit automakers and got put on the assembly line where his job was to install the passenger seat in the front. And so when he showed up to work, an interesting process sort of came out. He got over there, and the person who was working that station said, "Welcome, Steve, to our assembly line. We're glad you're here. What's going to happen is that the seat and the car is going to come down the line every 58 seconds, and all you're going to have to do is snap this over here, and you're going to push this there, and then snap this here, and so on. And voila, you'll install the seat, and then you'll get ready for the next one a couple seconds later because you've got 58 seconds to do each of these." You see how to do it, Steve? Now, Steve had degrees from Princeton and MIT, and so he said, "Yeah, I see how to do that. This is no problem." And so the first seat came down the line, and he tried to move this here and did this here, and the thing just did not install properly at all. And by the end of the 58 seconds, the guy had to stop the line and pull the cord, the rip cord, if you will, and redo it for him. And in the course of an hour, Steve only installed 4 seats correctly. Now, you see why I'm saying Georgia Tech's got some things on MIT. But the really interesting thing then is that you see from this process why inspection at the end of the assembly line was such a critical part of the Detroit automaker's process, because you couldn't guarantee that someone had put in their particular part accurately at the outset. And so you'd have to do inspection, or what in education we call summative assessment, at the end with the car coming off to see what percentage of defects and so forth that you had to do so that you could send it back to rework, what in education we call remediation or credit recovery, so that we could rehabilitate, if you will, the car. Now, when Steve, however, went to Toyota, he had a very different experience. Here, basically the person who was helping him with install the front passenger seat said, "Steve, you see there's 7 steps to installing the passenger seat. And we're going to teach you the first step right now. And you're not allowed to move on to learning the second step until you've mastered the first step. If you master it in 10 minutes, then you can start learning the second step right away. And if it takes you an hour, then it takes you an hour. And if it takes you a day, it takes you a day. But you don't have the right to learn the second step until you've truly mastered every single time how to do the first step. Now, think about that. He had to master each of those 7 steps before he was allowed to go to the assembly line and actually start installing these passenger seats. Which means that by the time he actually got to that place on the assembly line, Steve knew how to do this process correctly every single time. And Toyota didn't have to do the massive inspections at the end of the assembly line to see what percentage defects they had in their cars, because they could verify that their workers actually knew correctly how to install everything right from the outset. So assessment was still a critical part of this system, but it was literally built into the instructional process for teaching Steve how to install these passenger seats. And what a world of difference for the process. Now, as we think about education and how our education system works today, which one does it fall into? It looks a lot like that Detroit system in many ways. What happens is we have a system with fixed time and variable learning. And so we deliver content experiences to students, much in the way I'm doing right now. And then just actually answer me, I'll call on you, which will be unusual, but say you're in the middle of a 3-week unit in high school math, say. What happens at the end of the 3-week unit? You get a test, right? So we test and assess, and then what happens? Every student moves on, regardless of the percentage correct that they actually mastered or whether they even got a passing grade, and you get the results only afterward. But you've kept moving on and the point of learning is passed. Now contrast this with a competency-based learning system, where you still offer learning experiences for students, and you still test and assess, because testing and assessment is absolutely critical. But now it's interwoven into the instructional process, so you get almost real-time and interactive feedback that informs what students do next. And you only truly progress once students have actually mastered the learning. What a world of difference this creates. Now, the challenge is that our education system was actually modeled upon factories, similar to the Detroit line. And so the whole goal was actually to look like a factory, to standardize the way we teach and test. And we do it quite well. And the purpose of it, though, was to have an education system fit for the Industrial Revolution, to literally produce students that would be great line workers in factories and so forth. And your purpose was not to educate every single child successfully. Instead, the purpose was actually to sort students out at various intervals. The thought experiment I like to do is, what if Thomas Jefferson were to come back alive today and look at our education system? What would his reaction be? And I actually think he'd spike the football and declare success. Because if you read his writings, what he said very clearly in his letters to Virginia was that he wanted a system that would basically sort students out into different groups by ability. The first sorting would be the large mass of workers, if you will. The second sorting would be people that went a little bit further in their schooling and would be able to be the managers of those workers, in effect. And then the third group would be a very small group that would advance to higher education, very small group, who would be fit for the political leadership of the country. And in effect, our school system does that really quite well. The problem is that the world happens to have changed into a knowledge economy for which we need to prepare every single student to be a contributing member, not just of the workforce, but of society. So the demands have changed, and so this education system creates this thing in education that we call the Swiss cheese problem, where because you can't verify that students have learned every single concept when they progress, you get huge holes in their learning. And this just doesn't make sense for this reality. And so the question is, how do we move to this competency-based learning system that's really focused on mastery and so forth? And I just thought I'd give a definition from the work that INACOL, which is the K-12 International Online Learning Association, and Competency Works, gives for what mastery-based learning at high quality is. And they basically, as you can see, have 5 parts of their definition. The first part is that students only advance when they actually have mastered concepts, not based on the calendar. So you don't create these holes in your learning. The second thing is that competencies include explicit, measurable, transferable learning objectives that empower students. And what that means is that the concepts have to be transparent to students ahead of time, so they actually understand what the standards that they're responsible for learning, and that they can start to become owners of their own learning as well, which is drastically different than the way we do education today. The third thing is that assessment is meaningful and positive experience for students because it helps inform what they need to do next, and it becomes a learning tool as opposed to a punitive one. The last two really speak to the high quality aspect of this, which is that students receive differentiated support for their individual learning needs. And then the last ones are that the learning outcomes actually emphasize the application and creation of knowledge, along with the importance of skills and dispositions and so forth. So not just a narrow academic curriculum, if you will, but something that actually prepares you to be successful in life.